Are you tired of wasting your time on ineffective training methods? Are you confused about the buzz around Zone 2 training? Well, get ready to challenge the status quo, because in this video, we're going to shake up the running world by declaring that Zone 2 training for over 50s runners is a waste of time. But wait, why is everybody obsessed with Zone 2 training anyway? And is it really the golden ticket to help boost your endurance and running performance? We're about to unravel the truth behind this controversial routine and why it might actually be holding you back from your full running potential.
Whoa, Brad, there's a couple of things we need to clear up first. So firstly, Zone 2 training is vital for runners over 50. The confusion really lies around the fact that what is Zone 2 training, as well as how much do you really need.
All right, Lindsay, I understand that, but we still haven't cleared up the fact of whether or not we should be running in Zone 2 as an over 50s runner.
Look, Brad, we'll get to that shortly. But I think what's really important for you to understand is what is Zone 2 and how do we define it. There are a lot of models that people use. At Coach Parry, we like to work off a 5-zone model: Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, Zone 4, Zone 5. And really a lot of people spend too much time in Zone 1 and then too much time in Zone 3, 4, and 5. And I think that's where the main misunderstanding comes from in terms of what is Zone 2. So let's unpack what happens in Zone 2 and why it is in fact important to have Zone 2 training as part of your overall package. Now, Zone 2 training is specifically designed to teach your body to burn oxygen while it is generating energy. So we can generate energy from a couple of pathways where we use carbohydrates, where we use fats, where we use ketones, and where we can even use the lactate or lactic acid that is building up, that is taking place during exercise. Now, of all of those, burning fats and burning ketones and a small amount of proteins is the most efficient way for your body to produce energy for you to keep going, and those require oxygen, okay? And that is deemed aerobic conditioning, and that is ultimately what we are trying to improve when we are doing Zone 2 training. On the converse side of that, we've got pyruvate, which also requires some oxygen to burn, and we've got carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates can burn in oxygen, but it's a far less efficient fuel source, and it's the fuel source that we use when we are running low on oxygen or the body can't supply more oxygen. So in other words, as we move into Zone 3, Zone 4, and ultimately Zone 5, and we are starting to get to our maximal energy demand, that is when we are starting to burn a lot more energy in non-oxidative pathways called anaerobic pathways in the absence of oxygen. Okay? When we are training for things like 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, and the marathon, we are going to have different contributions from aerobic and anaerobic pathways. The majority of our energy we want to be coming from aerobic pathways. So the stronger we are aerobically, in other words, the more oxygen we can supply and the more energy that we can give while we are using oxygen, relatively faster speeds we can attain while we are aerobic. But then we're always going to need to top that up with anaerobic, particularly as you've probably experienced in a marathon. The routes aren't always perfectly flat. In fact, you're going to go through phases where you have to climb a little bit, where you go down the hill on the other side. And so there's this interaction between the aerobic and the anaerobic. And I don't want you to think of energy metabolism as a light switch, where we go from aerobic to anaerobic. It's not like one switches off and the other one switches on. We are always on a continuum where we are at quite low intensities or Zone 2 intensities, then the majority of our energy is coming from aerobic pathways, but we're still getting some from anaerobic. And when we get to very high intensities, we are maxing out on our aerobic. So aerobic is still giving that energy, but we're getting a much bigger contribution from anaerobic as we get towards our maximum. And so we've got this constant interplay between one and the other. And I briefly touched on then the pyruvate cycle, or your body's ability to take lactate and then push it back into the energy cycle, and that will happen when we go through these periods of anaerobic and we now are producing greater amounts of blood lactate, and it starts to build up in the blood. But as we get back to aerobic, that will of course then be shuttled back into the cell. The lactic acid will be converted back into lactate, and it'll go into the energy cycle, and we will be producing energy using that lactic acid which came from that anaerobic component of exercise. So you can see that it's a complicated system that works on a continuum, and it is important that we make sure that we are actually training in zone 2 when we need to train in zone 2, and then we bring a mix to the party.
Okay, Lindsay, so there's obviously a lot more to this than meets the eye, but I think the big question is zone 2 running the holy grail for over 50s running? I mean, is there a more effective way to train if you're over 50? And how do you even know what zone you're running in the first place?
Okay, before we answer if it's a waste of time, the important thing is, how do you know that you are running in zone 2? At Coach Parry, we like to use a percentage of threshold, and we typically use pace because that is something that is really readily available. Most people have a GPS device that gives you exactly what pace you are running, but we can also use threshold heart rate. You can get your threshold heart rate and your threshold pace by doing a simple time trial test, and then we can estimate what that threshold is. And then importantly, to know that you are in zone 2, you want to be at about 65 to 75% of your maximum heart rate or maximum pace, and you want to be at between 75 and 85% of your threshold pace or threshold heart rate. If you can't calculate those and you have to rely on how you're feeling, then running in your zone 2, you should be able to hold a robust conversation or be able to sing a song, but it shouldn't be super easy to do that. Okay, you must be able to do it and hold that robust conversation and feel just slightly short of breath. But you don't want to get, like if you sing a song, at the end of that song, you shouldn't now have to really focus on getting your oxygen back. You should then be able to slip into carrying on running quite comfortably, and then you will know that you are in fact running in zone 2.
Okay, Lindsay, we get the point about zone 2, but should we be running in zone 2?
So Brad, I think now we've gotten to the crux of the question, and that is that we shouldn't only be running in zone 2. And a lot of people get caught on the notion that we need to do all our training in zone 2, partly because of how much emphasis we put on it, because it is really important. And I think that's the part that we have to move away from, particularly as you are moving into your 50s. It becomes more important that we add other types of training into the mix, because it's not only about the energy metabolism, which is important. We do want to train that anaerobic component. As I mentioned much earlier in the video, when we are running marathons, half marathons, 10Ks, we are moving up and down this ladder of aerobic to anaerobic. So we have to have the ability to change along that continuum efficiently and effectively, but it's also about the loss of coordination, the loss of strength, the loss of range of motion. And as we move into zone 3 and zone 4, and in particularly zone 5 training, we are forced to have much longer strides. We are forced to increase that range of motion. The firing frequency of our muscles changes, and it helps us to improve our coordination. So training as we get 50 is as much about training the energy system as it is also about keeping us elastic, keeping us nimble, keeping us coordinated, and maintaining our range of motion so that we can run as fast as we want to run for as long as we can. So how do we get this balance right? And that is where the magic comes in. We need to be doing zone 2 training, particularly if you've been battling with injury, you've been getting sick often, or you're having to restart running after a long break away from the sport. Then we need to do a large body of zone 2 work to prepare your body for the work that needs to come. If you are getting ready to train very hard for a marathon, for example, we want to go through a period where most of your training will be in zone 2. And then as we start moving to more specific periods of training for a race, we want to be doing between 80 and 90% of our training in zone 2. That's quite a large chunk. And the other 10 to 20% of the training we're going to be spreading through zone 3 to zone 5 workouts. Now, what does that mean practically? Okay, so if we are training for 5 hours a week, you want to be doing between 3.5 and 4 of those hours at zone 2. You can hold a robust conversation. You're at 75% of maximum heart rate or maximum pace. That is where we're going to then spend the majority of our training, and then we want to spend that other hour to maximum hour and a half doing very high intensity workouts. We want to do some zone 3 and zone 4 work so that you know what it feels like on race day, but we also keep that quite small. Generally, I'd only do that kind of workout every 2 to 3 weeks, but I would be at the high end in the zone 5 again, so that I can emphasize the anaerobic very well, but much more importantly, so that I can really get through that range of motion, push myself from a coordination point of view. And what you'll find when you start training like this is that initially, it won't be your fitness that's going to hold you back and slow you down on your interval work, but it's actually the coordination. So as you do more of this workout, yes, we're stimulating the anaerobic, but you'll actually get better because your coordination will improve and your range of motion will improve.
Okay, so mobility and range of motion is really important, but the good news is you can fast track that process. If you watch the video that's on screen now, we'll show you 5 running drills that you can do to speed up that process.